Okay, welcome back to our class this week. We're going to keep doing the Cold War and the origins of the Cold War, and hopefully get through this kind of early phase, which is really critical. This first 5-year phase from 1945 to 50. When I started teaching, back over a decade ago, I think this discussion had a lot more timeliness for people since the Cold War, in fact, was a reality or had just more or less ended. And I think now, it's especially after 9/11, it's strikingly different. But make no mistake, this is really a critical phase in 20th century history. I don't know if anything, certainly in the second half of the 20th century, is more critical than this period and the conflict between the United States with its particular aims and the Soviet Union with its goals. And that's where we're going to pick up. Last time we talked about what the Cold War was, this kind of political war, this war that doesn't really become a shooting war, a hot war in Europe, and we talked about America's goals, which we're familiar with already. I mean, Dean Acheson was quite candid. If we want to maintain the kind of society we have, with the kind of lifestyle we have, with freedom and free institutions and political democracy, then we need to find markets. So America's goal, obviously, as part of our mantra already, is to maintain and expand the open door. We talked about Keynes and what he wanted to do with the British. I mean, Britain is trying to hold on to the last remnants of empire, but knows that its days are numbered because the United States has used the war and will use the post-war period to open up the Sterling Bloc. And now we want to talk about the Soviet goals, because clearly this alliance that was in place during the war isn't going to survive into the post-war period. The ideas, the visions are too different. So, the Americans want to pursue the open door. The British want to try to maintain some vestiges of empire. What does the Soviet Union want? This was always kind of an item of speculation, but in the last 10 or 15 years, a bunch of the Soviet records have come open now with the demise of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. A lot of these records are available, so people have gone, they've gotten them, they've translated them. And there's a really striking report from 1944, 1945 that came out, which I think really, really is instructive in talking about this period. 3 of the leading Soviet diplomats were Ivan Maisky, Maxim, who was a foreign ministry official, Maxim Litvinov, who was the Soviet foreign minister, the equivalent of the Secretary of State, and Andrei Gromyko. Gromyko was around until, I think, almost the 90s, in fact, and he was the ambassador to Washington at the time. And they were writing reports back to Stalin from throughout 44 and 45, and which, explained the Soviet Union's relationship with the United States and what they thought would happen in the post-war era. One theme that's common in every single one of these reports is security. All right, all of them from the first suggest that in the post-war period, the Soviet Union will need to have secure borders. The legacy, obviously, of World War II is huge. They have just, and this is something that even most conservative scholars point out, that the salient factor in the Soviet Union in 44, 45, and the immediate post-war era is the huge, amazing, awesome level of destruction and loss that the Soviet Union incurred as a result of the war. Who knows, 25, 40, 50 million people, millions of farms and factories, railroads, everything. The country is simply devastated. So the number one concern is going to be security. Now, obviously, within that, they're going to want expansion and growth in Eastern Europe and power and influence and money and all that kind of stuff. But the most fundamental level at the root, it's going to be how to prevent this from happening again, because they're traditionally being invaded in the 20th century. Ivan Maisky says the principal Soviet goal is to have Germany, which of course is the major threat here, rendered harmless by dismemberment, occupation, disarmament, reparations, and re-education. Okay, so it sounds like the French after World War I, doesn't it? The Russians are saying that. The Russians want to prevent the formation in Europe of any powers with powerful armies. They don't want to have a military opponent capable of inflicting harm upon them. They want to be sure that Poland, which remember, borders Russia, in between Russia and Germany, that Poland, even if vigorous and independent, is not too strong or too big. For nobody can be certain that our traditional enemy of Russia in the past will really become his friend in the future. So overall then, Maisky is very candid. We need security. We'll do pretty much whatever we have to do to get it. Now what's surprising is that the Soviet diplomats were also very optimistic about maintaining decent relations with the United States. They believed that the U.S. would be interested in maintaining cordial economic and political cooperation with the Americans. Maxim Litvinov, the foreign minister, says that Americans and Soviets have a mutual interest in having a kind of a stable, cooperative environment. However, they also understand that there are real significant problems. And it's really a very prophetic analysis. The Soviet diplomats really kind of nail it. They said that they expect the Americans to be considerably softer on Germany than the Soviet Union will be, kind of understanding the kind of Wilsonian vision after World War I. Litvinov says, and this is really striking, Litvinov says, America's #1 goal in the Cold War, in the post-war era, will be opening the doors of the British Empire. This is the Soviet Union recognizing that America's #1 goal will be opening the doors of the British Empire. All right? So this isn't some kind of secret conspiratorial plan. It's quite clear for the world, based on what Acheson has said and clearly based on what the Soviets see, that ending the colonial system, the trading system, the imperial preference system is really going to be essential. When we talk about globalization, this is really another benchmark era in globalization and leading us to modern globalization. You clearly in the 1890s you see it. You see it in the phase after World War I, but then the Great Depression comes in and kind of creates a barrier to that process. But now you're going to see kind of globalization gone wild after World War II, and the Soviet Union and the Soviet ministers understand that. Ivan Maisky, a diplomat, says that he foresees the Americans creating an extremely dynamic imperialism. And this again is very prophetic. Maisky says, it's not going to be an old school imperialism. It will be the expansion of a new type, not so much territorial or military as financial and economic annexation. So the Russians are aware that the Americans will be bent on what he calls empire, but it won't be kind of European empire. It won't be like the British Empire. It will be this open door empire. All right? Ivan Maisky also says, however, that, and this is kind of his conclusion, America can create many serious problems for us by stimulating the resurrection of Germany and Japan, by building up the anti-Soviet bloc in Europe using such countries as France. So even though there's hope for the future, the Soviet Union understands that its security interests, are threatened by what it perceives as America's open door imperialism and its need to have other countries participate in that. So, you can see that at the outset, and this is really before the war is even over. The United States wants to expand the open door, the British want to maintain the empire, and the Soviet Union wants to have kind of a rigid security apparatus in place in Eastern Europe. All right? So this is kind of the outset. Relations deteriorating quickly by 1944 and 45, and this is the next part of the outline, if it's up there. The Russians can go to hell. This is actually from a Harry Truman quote. Even before the war is over, the U.S. begins to have great suspicions of the Soviet Union. There's a great debate as to kind of the roots of the Cold War, responsibility for the Cold War. Typically, I think I said this last week, the American rationale was always that Joseph Stalin was hell-bent on taking over the world, and the United States had to act defensively. So it was actually the U.S. acting defensively against this really aggressive kind of new Hitler, and taking whatever measures were necessary to protect freedom and democracy and all that kind of stuff with it. However, if you look at what American officials were saying at the time, you get a much different story. A State Department report in 1945 said the Russians are not too greatly concerned about developments in Western Europe so long as the Western European countries do not show signs of ganging up on them. this is a very realistic, kind of candid appraisal. They're probably not going to cause trouble unless they have some sense that they're under siege. All right, this isn't, they're hell bent on world destruction or anything like that. A lot of Americans recognize Soviet limits and Soviet behavioral limits after the Second World War ended. In Hungary, which was a place occupied by the Red Army, there were free elections. Stalin did not stop those elections. Stalin withdrew Soviet troops from Czechoslovakia. We'll talk about that later. Czechoslovakia actually has a non-communist government there. In Austria, basically an anti-communist government was established. Stalin didn't stop that. There's more, and we'll talk later about China and Greece as well. So in all these kind of powder keg situation and all these kind of key points, these pivot points, Stalin does not act in any way aggressively or with an undue, kind of participation. And one thing that's really important in this period that I think, historically is really vital to understand is that in every instance when confronted, Stalin retreated. In every instance when given an opportunity to try to exploit a situation, Stalin basically bailed. Outside of Eastern Europe, which the Soviet Union occupied, which the Red Army occupied, no doubt about that, and established friendly communist governments, there is no indication of any kind of Soviet adventurism or aggression. So the entire rationale for the United States in the Cold War has basically been undermined. This idea that they're out to save democracy, that there's this rampant aggressive power trying to take over the world. That's just not the case. And that's important because American globalization is actually offensive. It's not defensive. It's intended to go into all these areas of the world and create an open door situation to find markets, to find resources, to find labor, and so forth. Okay, it's not a response in any way to Soviet behavior, and that's really critical. One American official even admitted, it is by no means certain that Soviet intentions are set irrevocably in the pattern of expansion facilitated by revolution. So those in the State Department and the military who know the Soviet Union, who understand it, in 1944 and 45 are saying, they're probably not going to act crazy. Don't worry about it. Everything's fine. The president doesn't see things the same way, and his major advisors don't either. Truman, on one hand, is inexperienced. He doesn't know a lot about the world. But you can't really say the same about his advisors. What's really crucial here is to understand that having the Soviet Union established as your foe, as your enemy, as an implacable force committed to all kinds of evil deeds is really essential if you want to expand your own presence throughout the globe. Okay, to just do it unilaterally, I mean, that's not what Americans do, right? Americans don't do that kind of thing. They don't, overthrow governments and all that kind of stuff, right? So the idea here is that you have to create this enemy, this scapegoat, in order to legitimate and justify what's going on. So on one hand, Truman, yeah, he's not experienced, he's not the brightest bulb in the package, but that kind of lets people off the hook. People would say that about Reagan or Bush too. They're not very bright. Well, that may be true, but the fact of the matter is they're not surrounded by idiots, and clearly Truman is surrounded by some of the brightest, wisest people to ever conduct U.S. foreign policy. All right? So it's not just that Truman blunders and he's a dumbass, it's that there is in fact a reason to exaggerate the threat you're up against, because that legitimates what you do. In the face of this kind of horrendous evil threat, then you can get away with a lot, and they're going to play this for a half century. You want to invade another country. Well, they're communist. You want to restrict people's rights at home or throw people in jail. Well, they're communist. You want to have a Red Scare. Well, they're communist. You want to overthrow a government in the Middle East or in Latin America. Well, they're communist. So this becomes the rationale for pretty much all kinds of mayhem. You want to spend trillions of dollars on weapon systems you don't need. Well, the communists are out there, right? So this becomes kind of the Salem witches of the 20th century. I use that reference because Arthur Miller actually wrote a play, using that. So even though people who know are suggesting the Soviet Union is really not a threat, that's not the rhetoric and the actual policy line coming out of the White House. Admiral William Leahy, who's the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says, the time has arrived to take a strong American attitude toward the Soviets. What's the basis for all this? What's behind this idea that we have to get tough with them? It's because of Eastern Europe. It's because of Poland. All right. Principally, I mean, Poland's really important here. I mean, I talked a lot about it. You think this is a weak country. It's a corridor. You know, it's in between Germany and Russia. But it's also important, you know, kind of almost metaphysically in that what happens in Poland, the U.S. sees as a test case. What happened in Poland? Yeah, clearly. I mean, there was an election there that the communists were not going to lose. All right. And so Stalin does, and the conservatives attack FDR. He sold out Eastern Europe. He sold out the Poles. Roosevelt's secretly a communist. It's actually, frankly, die Russiawelt, you know, all kinds of weird stuff like that. So what is behind these incredibly dire statements about the Soviet Union is this idea they took over Eastern Europe, they're not going to stop. Okay, and if somebody would suggest, well, you know, this is what traditional European powers do, and the Soviet Union has been invaded and they lost 40 million people, that would have no bearing. Right? Now, if you look at a lot of the reports, that's really kind of front and center. The Soviet Union is in no position to threaten us. I mean, everyone who has any sense at all in the American policymaking establishment knows that, and you see this all the time. They've just been wiped out. They really don't, even if they had the intent, even if ideologically or they had the intent to cause us harm, they really can't do it. All right? They've just lost millions upon millions of people, and the country's been devastated, and the infrastructure's been devastated. And beyond that, what does the U.S. have that they don't have? The atomic bomb, right? An atomic monopoly, all right? So clearly then, when the Americans are suggesting otherwise, it's not based on kind of a reasoned analysis of Soviet intents and capabilities, but in fact, it is a casus belli to legitimate what they plan on doing, which is to expand the open door, to globalize American corporate economics throughout the world. So Leahy says, the time has arrived to take a strong stand. Harry Truman, on his first day on the job after Roosevelt dies and he's sworn in, says to his Secretary of State, we must stand up to the Russians. We've been too easy on them. All right. Truman later would say, we have to stop babying the Soviet Union. Unless Russia's faced with an iron fist and a strong language, another war is in the making. And again, what's the justification for that? Communist in Poland, communist in Poland, principally. Because if you look, and we'll talk more about it, in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and elsewhere, it's not that clear cut. It's not. The Soviet Union doesn't come in and like consolidate Eastern Europe immediately. It's not that easy. This is not as powerful a country. I mean, what's really striking, and this has always been part of the conservative critique, is they build the hell out of the Soviet Union. It's an incredibly powerful country. It can do this, it can do that. The Soviet Union's never had those capabilities. It may have been the second superpower, but the gap between the U.S. and Soviet Union in the 40s, and really throughout the entire Cold War, was always staggering. The U.S. has never really had any kind of serious rival for global power since 1945. And to just, I mean, the Soviet Union, you know, it's a nuclear power, so that I think kind of does give it, you know, obviously some level of legitimacy. But at the same time, it never had any kind of capacity to conduct offensive, aggressive operations, right? And the U.S. pretty much knows that throughout this entire period. So when Truman says we have to stop babying them, we have to act with an iron fist, it's because of what's happened in Poland. But even more than that, it creates a legitimation for what the U.S. is going to do for globalization. Make no mistake, this is about globalization. This is about expand. Remember Bretton Woods and the IMF and the World Bank, that's really the crucial stuff. When people talk about the origins of the Cold War, they often don't even mention that. That's not even on the radar screen. But you know, if you want to talk about why the Cold War took shape, I mean, look at what happened at Bretton Woods and this vision. Look at what Atchison said, right? If we want to maintain the kind of life we have, we need to find markets. So this is really kind of about the globalizing mission. And that's really critical. Truman continues maintaining this hard line. He has a meeting with Molotov, Vyacheslav Molotov, the foreign minister, and he says, Molotov said that Truman lectured me in words of one syllable. All right? And he said, we want a new government in Poland. And this is what always comes out. We want a new government. What about Poland? What about Poland? We want, you know, this is a major issue. Molotov says, I've never been talked to like that in my entire life. Diplomats are always very nice to each other, right? You don't cuss and swear at him usually. And Truman says, carry out your agreements and I won't talk to you like that again. He's lecturing almost like a parent to a child. So this doesn't really sit well, especially with regard to Poland. Stalin himself says, Poland historically has been a corridor for attack. We are not going to allow an anti-communist and anti-Soviet government in Poland. It's just not going to happen. Okay? We are going to vigilantly maintain friendly forces in Poland because we're not going to be attacked and invaded again. Okay. Stalin says, Poland was weak. Russia wants a strong Poland. It is not only a question of honor for Russia, but one of life and death. Right? Truman, however, doesn't buy any of this, and in fact, at one point, when people are talking about the Soviet Union, kind of not going along with the U.S., Truman says, if the Russians do not wish to join us, they can go to hell. All right? So clearly then at the outset, this American hard line is established, and the idea of kind of having any kind of reasonable chance for accommodation at that point isn't really going to happen. Okay? Truman, in fact, I just say this because it's kind of Orwellian. Truman, in fact, says, we need the forces, we need to have more atomic weapons. Why? To support a lasting peace by force if necessary. This is kind of Orwellian, peace through war kind of thing, right? We need more atomic weapons because we have to have peace, and how are we going to have it by force? So it's very strange Lovian, right? At one point, Molotov asked James Burns, who's the American Secretary of State, this I say too because it's a good quote, asked James Burns, because the United States once after Hiroshima is waving the atomic bomb around, I think, which kind of gives credence to the Alperovitz line. This comes up all the time. We have the atomic bomb. And finally, Molotov says to Burns, do you carry that thing in your pocket? And Burns says, you don't know us Southerners. We carry our artillery in our pocket. If you don't cut all of this crap and let us get down to work, I'm going to pull an atomic bomb out of my hip pocket and let you have it. Now, that may sound funny, it sounds silly, but, if you're the Soviet foreign minister and the American Secretary of State is saying, I have an atomic bomb in my pocket, I'm going to let you have it, you don't take that as a joke. That's fairly serious stuff. It's a major breakdown. The Soviet Union, and you don't have to like the Soviet Union, I'm certainly not trying to in any way, suggest Joe Stalin is a Boy Scout, but the fact of the matter is, the Soviet Union can't do that. They can't say, we have an atomic bomb in our back pocket and we're going to because they don't have any, all right? So to suggest somehow that there's kind of an equivalence here, it's just not. There's a prima facie evidence against it because they don't have the atomic bomb. They can't play atomic diplomacy. Not a question of whether they would have. If they'd had it first, yeah, I'm sure they would have. Who wouldn't have, right? That's major power politics. But in fact, the U.S. did, and has to be held accountable for it. All right. Making matters worse, in early 1946, one of the kind of major documents of the entire Cold War era arrives in Washington, D.C., and it's called the Long Telegram. And it was written by a guy named George Kennan. And George Kennan is still around. He's I think he just turned 100. And he's still fairly lucid. He still writes op-ed pieces. He's really an incredible guy. Kennan is one of the fathers of the Cold War because of this particular document, the Long Telegram. Before I talk about it, though, Kennan very quickly, within a matter of years, had a change of heart. He really regretted the role that he had played in creating this animosity, and he's still doing it. I mean, he spent, almost 60 years now trying to kind of undo what he had done in the Long Telegram. In it, he takes a very hard line. He's the expert. He's the American expert on the Soviet Union. He's in Moscow, and he sends this Long Telegram because it's massive. I don't know, it's I forget, 20-some thousand words or something like that. It was later reprinted. And it's this big analysis of the Soviet Union. And he says, and it's hardcore. He later was embarrassed. He said it sounded like something that the Daughters of the American Revolution would have put out. And it talks about how the Soviet Union's evil and the U.S. is good, and the Soviet Union is a political force committed fanatically that there can be no cooperation with the U.S., and it's really hardcore. But the guts of it is that Kennan comes up with a strategy, a doctrine, more than a strategy, it's actually a doctrine on how to deal with the USSR in the Cold War, and that's the doctrine or the strategy of containment, okay? And containment will be the kind of buzzword for, a half century. What does it mean to contain something? What is containment? Okay, to keep something from spreading. It doesn't mean you kill it. It doesn't mean you get rid of it. Okay, that's very difficult. That would probably involve another war. Nobody's going to do that. Nobody seriously considers that. I mean, you often hear, well, if they'd listened to Patton and gone on to Prague, nobody was going to do that. That wasn't ever even contemplated. All right? For one thing, the U.S. and Soviet Union were allies, so it's kind of hard to kind of fight a war and then make war on your allies, and it's just an absurd idea. So you can't get rid of it, but you need to contain it. You need to keep it from spreading. All right? So in early 1946, if you want to contain the Soviet Union, where are you containing it within? Well, you're trying to keep it out there, but where are you trying to keep it in? And what else? Not just the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, okay? So containment basically applies then to what region of the world, according to Kennan? Eastern Europe. Okay, so we're talking about a very narrow area. When Kenneth says we need to contain them, it means we need to prevent them from spreading beyond Eastern Europe. Does it mean we get rid of them in Eastern Europe? No, Kenneth never says that. All right? How do we do that? How does the United States contain the Soviet Union? Pretty much using whatever forces it needs to, militarily, politically, using what Kenneth says. Kenneth says it's counterforce at a series of constantly shifting geographical and political points. It means wherever it looks like they're probing, we have to be there to prevent them from doing that. Okay, so this is containment. Now, from that point on, containment is the doctrine, the characteristic of America's Cold War policy. And the U.S. will devise and execute actions in such a way as to contain not just the Soviet Union, basically anything it perceives to be detrimental and nefarious to American corporate globalization interests. So containment will take on a character and a face considerably, inconceivably different than anything Kennan had envisioned. It becomes much bigger than a series of counterforce in Eastern Europe. It becomes everything. Everywhere in the globe is containment, right? There's somebody spouting some kind of leftist rhetoric in Haiti, it's containment. In Dominican Republic, in Iran, in Guatemala, in Egypt, in Lebanon, wherever, Vietnam, Korea, it's containment. That's not what Kennan had envisioned. But in the larger context now, the Cold War is about containing the Soviet Union. It's about containing, but more than that, it's about containing the spread of governments or forces or ideas that challenge the power of the United States or the growth of liberal capitalism. So containment's not just keeping the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. That's what Kennan intended it to be. What it becomes is containing anything that in some way will kind of harm liberal capitalism. All right? So containment becomes really big. It becomes the major, the core of the Cold War. After Kennan introduces his doctrine of containment, just a month later, Winston Churchill is speaking at a college in Missouri, and where he issues the famous Iron Curtain speech, where he says, that the Soviet Union is irrevocably committed to revolution. They're bent on expansion. Churchill says they desire the fruits of war and the indefinite expansion of their power and doctrines. Now, Churchill's saying they desire the indefinite expansion of their power and doctrines. At the same time, if you look at the actual documents, if you look at the reports and the briefings and the analyses coming out of Washington and probably London as well, I don't know that as well, nobody's suggesting that. In fact, what everybody's saying is they're actually behaving in a non-aggressive manner. And you'll see that. We'll go over it in Greece, in China, places like that. There's really Iran, which we'll talk about in a minute. There's no real hard evidence. I mean, this still gets back to Eastern Europe. But even more than that, as I said a million times already, this becomes a legitimation process. We need to legitimate, to make credible what we plan on doing. And in order to do that, we have to have this really horrible enemy there. Push the button. Okay.
Churchill understood this, right? I mean, Churchill earlier had told Stalin, "Hey, I may have to say some nasty things about you back home for domestic purposes."
Yeah, I mean,
he understands this really no.
He's talking about, yeah.
It doesn't rise to that degree.
No. Churchill's, you remember Churchill's fighting kind of two fronts, right? Well, Churchill's not prime minister anymore. He's lost the election. But on one hand, right, Churchill understands the Soviet Union isn't about to take over the world, right? But he's also trying to kind of, maintain this accommodation with the U.S. because he understands that, if the Soviet Union is enemy one, then the British Empire is 1A. So yeah, I think all of these guys, they're not dumb. They really aren't. Even Truman's not stupid. I mean, compared to Reagan and Bush, he's a freaking Rhodes Scholar. But they understand that the Soviet Union isn't. Everyone knows you don't have to be a genius to figure it. They just lost zillions of people, and the country's been wiped out. They don't have the atomic bomb. So yeah, Churchill also, remember the percentages deal I talked about last week where he and Stalin sit down and say, you get 50% of this and I get 90% influence here? Stalin never bucked it. He never violated it. And Churchill, in his memoirs, Churchill recognized that. So Churchill is an old Tory. I mean, he hates the Soviet Union. And Churchill, remember, was the guy who wanted to delay the Second Front so the Germans and Russians could bloody the hell out of each other. So, he's certainly no friend of it. But at the same time, yeah, he knows that's not true. He had a large part to play in seeing the Soviet Union decimated and crushed in the manner that it was. So Churchill, kind of says they're expansive, they're dominant. In fact, he knows that's not the case. And then he utters this famous line, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. And he's talking about Eastern Europe. An iron curtain meaning the Soviet Union has taken control over Eastern Europe. Okay, and that's where the famous line comes from. Stalin flips when he hears that and basically thinks, because in it Churchill calls for Anglo-Saxon unity. He's saying that basically saying all the good white Christians of the world have to get together. So Stalin actually compares Churchill to Hitler with these kind of racialist ideologies and racialist tones. Stalin's fears weren't unrealistic. I mean, clearly, by 1946, which is when this takes place, early 1946, there is, a major shift. I mean, the Cold War is in full bloom now. Cooperation that existed during the war is gone now. So, not only can Truman and Churchill, issue, wonderfully sounding rhetoric, that the Russians don't join us, they can go to hell, an Iron Curtain has descended, but they can put it into action, which is far more than Stalin can do. Stalin can issue edicts and talk and make threats, but mostly it's bluff because he doesn't have the stuff behind him to make good of it, to make good on it, right? So a lot of this is rhetoric. With the U.S., it's not, and you see this in 1946 in what becomes more or less the first armed crisis of the Cold War, and that takes place in Iran. Right? And Iran it's not terribly important by virtue of what happened, but it's incredibly instructive because it really sets a pattern in the Cold War that you'll see repeat itself, that you'll see recur. During the war, Iran was jointly occupied by the three major allies, and I lost my maps. I wonder why that happened. Anyway, I do know why that happened. Anyway, you kind of know where Iran is. Iran is in Central Asia. In Iran's northwest corner is a region called Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan shares a border with the Soviet Union, with Russia. Okay, if you can that's really all you need to know. Actually, here you get the benefit of my map making, right? All right, it's an exact replica. All right. Iran, of course, is important. Why? Because it produces a lot of oil, and Truman says the loss of Iranian oil would be, a serious loss for the economy of the entire Western world. And the Americans are also afraid that Russian influence in Iran could affect oil in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, and elsewhere. By 1945, the British and American troops had left Iran, but the Soviet Union was kind of dragging its feet. And in addition to that, the Soviet Union was supporting an insurgency in Azerbaijan. There's an indigenous insurgency there. The Soviet Union was supporting them. Clearly, they wanted oil concessions in Iran, the Soviet Union did. Beyond that, they were sending suggestions, documents to the Azerbaijani communists. And it's really striking if you look at what they're telling them to do. They're telling to establish land reform programs and health programs and create jobs and all kinds of stuff like that. Basically, the Soviet Union was telling Azerbaijan to create a new deal, in the communists in Azerbaijan to create a new deal system there. They want like welfare programs and all kinds of stuff like that, and taxes and whatnot. Far more, and what's really ironic, if you look at, and pretty much throughout the Cold War, setting aside, a lot of the evil that the KGB and institutions like that did, the Soviet Union generally is prescribing more or less a New Deal agenda, and the U.S. with allegedly all these liberal ideas is supporting these really reactionary and brutal forces for the most part. Because the Soviet Union is meddling in Azerbaijan, the U.S. acts swiftly, and they go to the United Nations and they threaten force and they demand withdrawal. And in April, very shortly after the crisis began, the Soviet Union withdrew. All right, I'm leaving out obviously a lot of detail, but in fact, in a very short period of time, all the U.S. had to do was go to the UN, get a statement of a statement of renunciation against the Soviet Union and threaten force. And the USSR withdrew. They left Iran with the promise to establish a Soviet-Iranian oil company, which would have to be approved by Iran's parliament, which is called the Majlis. In fact, the Majlis turned it down. So the Soviet Union didn't even get the promise of having an oil concession in Iran. In the face of American rhetorical pressure only, Stalin bailed. Stalin retreated. And he suffers a clear defeat in the first standoff of the Cold War. And this is instructive because you're going to see this time and again. This is on his border, right? This is more or less his home territory, right? I mean, can one imagine in the same circumstances, in Mexico or somewhere where the Monroe Doctrine could be invoked, the U.S. retreating, without a shopping fire? That's inconceivable, right? Yet Stalin, when confronted with the threat of American force in Azerbaijan, which does share a border with the USSR and is a vital area because of oil, he bails, he backs off. Okay, so in this confrontation, then Stalin bails and the U.S. succeeds. Yeah. What year is it? It's 46, early spring of 46. Also in 1946, and another indication of kind of America using its power, because in Iran, the U.S. and what's the subtext of all this? When the U.S. threatens force, what does it mean? We're going to send a bunch of troops in? Is that what the Soviet Union's thinking? What's he thinking? Atom bomb, nuclear weapons, okay? So that's a subtext for it. Now, more directly, there's also the issue of nuclear weapons in 1946. As a result of the U.S. having an atomic monopoly, the other countries of the world, understandably, especially the Soviet Union, are concerned about that. So they want some kind of international controls over nuclear weapons. And in charge of it for the United States is a guy named Bernard Baruch. If you've ever studied U.S. history, Baruch is an old fixer. He's the guy. He's kind of Jim Baker times 10. All right. Baruch is a banker. He's got connections everywhere. He's incredibly accomplished. So Harry Truman puts Baruch in charge of a program to create international control of the atomic bomb. Baruch wants to have international control of the atom with regular inspections, but he also demands that the Soviet Union give up its veto on any nuclear matters, and he says that the United States will not destroy any of its atomic bombs, because the goal ultimately is no atomic bombs. But the U.S. will withhold destruction of any of its bombs until it makes sure that all the other countries are inspected and they don't have any. Okay? Now, is the Soviet Union going to acquiesce in this? Are they going to suspend their atomic program and quit making atomic bombs and allow the Americans to keep theirs? That's not going to happen. Baruch knows that's not going to happen. So the Soviet Union balks, not surprisingly, at this, and Baruch says, you either accept our plan in total or nothing goes. Everything's off the table. And in fact, an arms race is inevitable at that point, because there's no way any foreign country, any enemy country, is going to accept this continued monopoly and simply give up. The Soviet Union had an atomic program going too, an atomic research program going too, and they would get the bomb, I think, in 1950, late 49, early 50, I believe. So, in no way in 1946 are they going to suspend that program and allow the Americans to come in and inspect it while they have an atomic monopoly. It's just not going to happen. So Baruch's plan was an aggressive attempt that he knew, I mean, even more than that. Clearly, he knew the Soviet Union wasn't going to accept that. All right? So in all of these early showdowns and all of these early issues, when they come up, what does the U.S. do? The U.S. takes a hard line, the long telegram, the Iron Curtain Doctrine. What happens when confronted? The Soviet Union backs off in Iran, and the U.S. refuses to have any kind of international control of the atom, any meaningful international control of the atom. So by 1946, I mean, clearly the U.S. has the upper hand. There's no question about it in this standoff, in this Cold War, right? And it's only going to become, more decisive subsequently. Anybody have any questions on this? I want to talk again about Germany, and this is really a crucial period. 1946, 47, 48, really, really important. Again, by this time it's clear that the cooperation that was evident during the war is over. That's not going to happen. And you can see the U.S. kind of now taking the initiative to really expand its own influence. The initial goal, remember, as after World War I, is to create and rebuild a viable Europe. Why? What's the real issue in Europe? The real agenda? Markets, to have viable economic partners. Okay, so that remains the goal. And so Europe will be divided as a result of that. All right. The strategy, remember, is containment. That doesn't mean we're going to take back Eastern Europe. That would be great, but that isn't the policy. It's maintaining what we have and keep containing the Soviet Union from going further. Now that means inevitably that you're going to have a divided Europe, right? And so in two areas you see this, early on in Germany and also in Greece. Germany, we've already talked about. That is the key to European economic reconstruction. However, the German economy is not doing well after the war. Coal production is very low. Exports are very low. In fact, the eastern zone, remember, Germany split into 4 zones, 3 western zones and the Soviet zone. And the Soviet zone actually economically does better than the western zones do. In 1946, however, the Soviet Union decides to change its occupation policies. It had been dismantling and factories and so forth in Germany. Remember I told you this, and putting them on rail and actually bringing them back to the Soviet Union and rebuilding them there. In 1946 they stopped doing that, and they decide to actually use the factories in Germany to produce goods in their own zone using German resources and German labor. It's not unlike slave labor. So they're going to actually force the Germans to build stuff for them, and then they send it back to Russia, ship the finished items back there. When the Americans hear about this, they get very upset, and they accuse the Soviet Union of violating the occupation agreements. And so the Americans say that they will no longer pay reparations to the Soviet Union. All right, so you can see basically that the occupation agreement has fallen apart, and this is in mid-1946. In September of 1946, the Secretary of State, James Burns, is speaking, and he goes even further. He said, we would like to have a unified Germany, but in fact, that's probably not likely. So Germany has to be given the chance to export goods and become self-sustaining. When Burns says Germany has to be given the opportunity to sustain itself, who's he talking about? All of Germany? The western zones, right. So Burns says, Germany is part of Europe, and recovery in Europe, and particularly in the States adjoining Germany, will be slow indeed if Germany, with her great resources of iron and coal, is turned into a poorhouse. So by 1946, the situation is so critical that the U.S. has to revitalize the German economy in order to rebuild the entire European economy. All right. Burns says, the German people under proper safeguards should now be given the primary responsibility for running their own affairs. Now this is really striking. Think about this. Barely a year after the Nazis were defeated, the U.S. Secretary of State is saying that the Germans should now have control over their own affairs. And who's running Germany? Right. Well, clearly Hitler's gone, right? And you've had trials in Nuremberg, and a bunch of the main Nazis have been convicted, and many have been executed. But who's actually running Germany? The 4 powers. Right. The 4 powers are politically, but within Germany, who's running the economy? Huh? It's actually remnants of the National Socialists. See, there was supposed to be what they called a denazification program, but what you're seeing in Iraq today is who run the country, who knew how to run things? The Nazis did. So what you have then are industrialists and politicos who were associated with the National Socialists, who actually return and have control over the German economy and work quite closely. The U.S. actually begins to actually ship in, start using Nazis as spies to spy on the Soviet Union. Who do you trust? Are you going to trust the German left? No. You'll trust the National Socialists because with Hitler gone and the National Socialist Party disbanded, what are these guys? They're good corporate capitalists. I mean, if you have to choose between the German communists and the German Nazis, it's an easy call. Who are you going to work with? Who can you trust? So, in fact, what you have isn't a denazification, it's more of a renazification in Germany. So the German economy remains, clearly a corporate capitalist economy. It's tinkered with by the U.S. But the real goal here is to create kind of a liberal, open door situation, not a closed, autarkic situation like that. And you can well imagine how the Russians feel about this. In fact, the Americans and the British and then the French actually merged their zones together. They were all autonomous. First they called it bizonia, 2 zones, and then finally trizonia when the French join in. This is a real step on the formation to separate countries. So even though they keep talking about we're going to have a unified Germany be one country, that's never really in the cards. I mean, that's rhetorical, but no one really conceives of that. So the Cold War is clearly being waged in earnest by this time. And this is by 46, 47. So Germany's divided. It won't officially become 2 countries until 1949, but by 46 it's already pretty much in the works. Another major theater in the Cold War in 1946 was in Greece. And this is a good story, mainly because you don't hear too much about it. Greece had always been part of the British sphere of influence. And in fact, when Churchill and Stalin do that percentages deal, Stalin says to Churchill, you have 90% influence in Greece. Okay? What's the situation like in Greece, however? Inside Greece, you had a government which was run by really brutal and bloody, kind of a fascist kind of government. It was a junta of colonels. And they were going on, a spree. It was a bloodbath. The Greek government was killing trade unionists and socialists and human rights workers. Upwards of 100,000 Greeks were probably executed and many imprisoned by the government. This is a real hardcore military junta in Greece. By no means a liberal or democratic government. No one could ever mistake anything in Greece and the Greek government for democracy. All right. Now there is an insurgency in Greece fighting against this government. Who do you think is part of the insurgency? Communists are. Okay? What is Stalin's relationship to this Greek communist insurgency? There are others in it. It's socialist and all kinds. But there's clearly a lot of communists opposing the government. What is Stalin's relationship to the Greek communists? He doesn't do it. No, none. As part of that deal with Churchill, he kind of keeps his hands off. The Soviet Union is demobilized, for one thing. It's dealing with problems that, the Americans have an atomic monopoly. But even Dean Acheson, who will later become Secretary of State, or may have been already at that time, said the Soviet Union would not act aggressively unless they are absolutely out of their minds. So at the same time, Truman says, we're going to have to scare the hell out of them and they can go to hell. Acheson, who's a real hardcore Cold Warrior, is saying the Soviet Union will not act aggressively, quote, unless they are absolutely out of their minds. So you know full well that they're not going to do anything. And Stalin's proving it. He's not giving a penny of aid to the Greek communists. That may be an exaggeration. There's probably some furtive, covert stuff coming in, but not much. Nothing open. And in fact, the Greek communists are in dire shape because the government is kind of wiping them out. Right? However, Truman sees an opportunity there. So in 1946 and 1947, the British come to Washington, D.C., and they say, you know what? We can't afford to help Greece out anymore. We love the colonels. We love that government. They're killing all the right people, but we can't pay for it anymore. Can you bail us out? Can you pick it up, And so the Americans have this choice now. Should we become Greece's sugar daddy? Okay? So Harry Truman decides if he's going to become Uncle Sugar or if he's just going to let Greece fend, leave Greece to its own devices. Now, what's Truman think? Well, there's communists in Greece, right? We want that government in place there because that government's killing all the people we don't like, all right? So we probably should help them out. But that's going to be hard to do. Right? One of his aides, so he's talking about it, one of his aides, in fact, says, there has been no, and so Truman obviously has to invoke the Soviet threat. That kind of goes without saying. One of his aides, George Elsey, says, there's been no overt action in the past by the USSR which serves as an adequate pretext for an all-out speech. However, a very influential senator, a guy named Arthur Vandenberg, says, you're not going to get this money, you're not going to get this program to help Greece out unless you scare the hell out of the American people. So Truman gives a speech, and what do you think his point is? If we don't help the Greek government, what's going to happen? Soviet communism, they're going to come in and take over. No evidence at all, because there was no Soviet involvement in Greece. No Soviet support of the Greek communists. Nonetheless, Truman makes this speech, and this becomes the Truman Doctrine. And it becomes more than simply helping out the Greeks, the Greek government, this reactionary, horrible junta. In his speech, Truman says, it is our responsibility to support free people everywhere. Free people, okay? The Greeks, run by this really horrible government, become free people everywhere. All right? So this is a major expansion of the Cold War, done entirely on the pretext that the Soviet Union is somehow meddling there when there's not a single shred of evidence to that. And in fact, Dean Acheson says that they won't act aggressively unless they're absolutely out of their minds. So what happens? Truman gets $400 million to give to Greece, a little bit to Turkey as well. Okay, and so the United States becomes Uncle Sugar to this horrible Greek government. Noam Chomsky, somebody you're probably familiar with, has written about this, which explains basically the Cold War. This is about Greece, but you could kind of describe the whole Cold War that way. Chomsky says, a Soviet threat was concocted in the routine manner, and Greece was pacified by a bloody campaign of terror and torture that took 160,000 lives, restored the old order, including Nazi collaborators, and opened the country to U.S. investment and control. That's a nice little nutshell about what happens in Greece and pretty much what happens in the Cold War. The old regime comes back into power, and American capital is treated very well, very, very friendly terms. All right? That's the Truman Doctrine. That's early 1947. Another major event in 1947, and this is really the consolidation of the Cold War. This is kind of a really bold display of power, an escalation of the Cold War, and a really sharp and visible display of power. You see this in the Truman Doctrine. You also see it in the Marshall Plan. You've all heard of the Marshall Plan. That's always referred to. We need a Marshall Plan for Iraq. We need a Marshall Plan for Kosovo. We need a Marshall Plan for urban America. We need a Marshall Plan for, we always hear that reference, right? What was the Marshall Plan? What was the Marshall Plan? You all know. It was the reconstruction of Western Europe. And why was it done? Yeah.
To build the economy.
Yeah, those are all true. Stop communism. But at the time, it was kind of projected in humanitarian terms. There's this horrible, terrible human calamity taking place, and we have to help them out. Almost kind of like, everything the U.S. is doing today has done in the past year to help Sudan, just so much, So basically, this is the idea. Europe's in trouble, right? And if Europe is in trouble, if people are unemployed, if people are poor, if people are hungry, they're out of work, they're homeless, what kind of political opportunities exist in Europe then? Who could take advantage of that? The communists, the left, right? Communists and socialists, because they can say, look, the system has failed you, you're out of work, you don't have unions, you don't have a welfare system, you don't have a job, you don't have food, all right? And in fact, there is clearly a movement to the left. There's this window of opportunity. Remember I talked about at the end of World War I, the forces of movement and the forces of order. Well, you see the same thing at the end of World War II, where the forces of movement, the left actually takes an initiative because the situation is bad, and they can say, look, this is what you need. You need a socialist government, you need a welfare system, you need a guaranteed income, you need a job, you need, food stamps, whatever. So clearly there is an opening, a window there for the left. In 1945, 46, 47. The U.S. doesn't like that. They're deeply concerned about that. That's what the Cold War is about, right? Stopping the left, containing the left. They say it's about containing the Soviet Union. It is in one particular area, but even more than that, it's about containing anything or any person or any force which isn't going to be open to the kind of constant exploitation of American capital in these areas. So it's about containing the European left. It's about containing socialists and labor unions and whoever, all right? And a major part of that then is going to become the Marshall Plan. The U.S. looks out and it sees that Europe is in trouble. People are hungry. People, don't have jobs. But even more than that, people are starting to look to the left. People are starting to look to the socialists and the communists. And in fact, a lot of socialists and communists are actually getting elected to office. And that's important, getting elected to office. They're not taking over power. I mean, Eastern Europe, that was imposed, right? Stalin comes through, he leaves the Red Army there. They take over, they put a communist government in power. That's pretty cut and dry, right? And it's easy for the Americans to reject that and say, oh my God, look at what they've done. But in Western Europe, in France, in Italy, in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, what's happening is that leftists, socialists and communists are actually being elected. Now, this is democracy, right? You have an election that people vote. What's the U.S. think of that? They have to accept that, right? They're happy with it. People are exercising their free choice, right? No. The U.S. is deeply upset that Henry Kissinger later on had the greatest quote on that. After Chile elected Allende, he said, we are not going to sit back and let people, what was it? We're not going to accept the irresponsibility of their own actions or something like that. I can't remember the precise quote. I'll get it. But basically Kissinger saying, if they want to act irresponsible and vote for somebody they like who happens to be a leftist, we're not going to sit back and let it happen. And this is basically the Cold War. So all these leftists are being elected in Western Europe. All these people are joining unions in Western Europe, and the U.S. doesn't like it. They don't like them exercising that level of control over their own political lives. So the U.S. has to do something about that. In July of 1947, the Secretary of State, George Marshall, gives a speech at Harvard, and he announces a plan. It's called the Marshall Plan. The actual term is ERP, the European Reconstruction Program. Just easier to call it the Marshall Plan. And he says, we have to help all these devastated countries recover from the horrors of World War II. Production is low, unemployment is high, hunger is high. Communist, socialist, and labor unions are becoming stronger. All right? So we are afraid that Americans, that the Europeans might turn to the left. George Kennan, the guy I just mentioned, was very candid about this. Kennan said in 1948, we have 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships that will allow us to maintain this position of disparity. Right? That's quite striking, right? He's being honest. We have 50% of the wealth, only 6% of the population. We got to keep that going. We got to keep it up, right? So one way to do that, and actually Kennan was talking about Asia, but one way to do that is through the Marshall Plan. All right? So the Marshall Plan will send aid to Europe. What will they do with that? They will use it to hopefully create, jobs, to increase production, to create welfare programs or food programs or whatever, to essentially give people a better life so that they will not be so likely to listen to the siren call of the left or of Moscow, which of course this has to emanate from Moscow, right? Clearly people in Western Europe wouldn't decide to vote socialist on their own. It must be somehow a plot from Moscow. That becomes the public rhetoric of it. This is like during the Vietnam era, LBJ would always say that the anti-war movement had been infiltrated by the communists, right? Because young kids on their own would never oppose a war, that had no basis in which they could be drafted and die in, right? So this is kind of one way of doing it. It's always some outside force's fault, right? It was the Soviet Union becomes the kind of real scapegoat. They become the bugaboo for everything that goes on in this period. So the Marshall Plan aims to take care of that. We will create a better world, a better life in Western Europe so that none of you people would even consider being socialist or communist. All right? All right? So that becomes kind of the selling point for it. But there's another reason, far more important, I think, behind the Marshall Plan. And it actually is a response to the economically stagnant situation in that region. Because trade was inadequate and investment was low. Why? Why was investment low? Because there's nothing to invest in. Why is trade low? Because people are trying to recover from the war and can't buy and sell things. As a result of that, in Europe you have, and I think this is a term I've used before, in Europe you have a dollar gap. Right? A dollar gap. This is, again, it's kind of like surplus capital. It's not terribly exciting or sexy to talk about. It's very important. A dollar gap is quite simple. It means that the countries that were destroyed in the war don't have enough dollars to spend on American goods. Why is that a problem? on a couple levels. They don't have dollars to use to buy American goods. What's that mean? What's it mean for them? For these countries that are devastated and don't have dollars? What's it mean? They can't buy the stuff they need to rebuild, right? Right? What's it mean for the Americans?
Exports are down.
Exports are down. They can't sell the stuff they need to sell to get the American economy going, right? So the Europeans lack the dollars they need to buy American goods with to rebuild from the war. And in the United States, we can't sell enough stuff to maintain the level of economic growth that we want because those countries don't have the dollars they need to buy it from us. All right? Now, in the U.S., exports more than doubled imports after World War II, because who's the U.S. going to import from? And remember, one thing that's really important, too, about World War II is what happens to the American economy during the war? It expands. No other country can say that. Everyone else is getting wiped out. The U.S. comes out of the war far better off than it went into it. It's hard to pull that off, right, in a world war, catastrophic global war with millions and millions killed and all the devastation and everything else. But the U.S. actually comes out better off economically, all right? So in order to maintain that, the U.S. has to maintain strong levels of exports. Well, you can't export your goods if nobody out there has the dollars they need to consume, to buy those goods. And remember, what's the world's currency? Bretton Woods, it's the dollar, right? So everybody wants dollars because it's a convertible currency. Everybody takes dollars, and dollars are based on the gold standard. So George Marshall, clearly is saying, hey, look, we need to save the people of Western Europe, but at the same time, he admits the consequences to the economy of the United States should be apparent to all. It is logical that the U.S. should do whatever it's able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no peace. So the Marshall Plan then not only tries to make life better for the Europeans, but it serves to address this dollar gap problem. It wants to help integrate Europe economically in this new Bretton Woods system. Right? In addition to that, the U.S. is pushing for low tariffs, no trading quotas, no currency controls. What does that sound like? Open door, or even more contemporary. What's it sound like? Sounds like the European community, right? The EC. It sounds like the WTO. It sounds like what the U.S. is doing in NAFTA in North America. This is the vision that these guys have. And Keynes, Keynes I think dies in 46. But this was Keynes' vision after World War I. Kind of a United States of Europe. A free market Europe. And this is what the U.S. wants to do in the Marshall Plan as well. To use this carrot of money to force Europe to have a different economic system, all right? So the Americans want European unity, they want lower tariffs, they want to put an end to this dollar gap, right? John Foster Dulles, who'd later be Secretary of State, he was a representative to the UN, said, a healthy Europe cannot be divided into small compartments. We need Europe to be unified, to be acting as one. It has to be integrated into a market big enough to justify modern methods of cheap production for mass consumption. Marshall himself says, the restoration of Europe involved the restoration of Germany. Without a revival of Germany's production, there can be no revival of Europe's economy. The head of General Motors, Alfred Sloan, says, European countries are just not comparable to the Germans in terms of their efficiency and economic importance. And he said, there is nothing that could convince us at General Motors to invest anywhere in Europe unless Germany is part of a revived European economy. So what's the point of the Marshall Plan then? To get dollars into the hands of all of these countries as a way to facilitate European integration and especially German economic recovery. Let me say that again. What's the point of the Marshall Plan? To get dollars into the hands of the Europeans so that they could facilitate European reconstruction and especially Germany's economic revival. Okay? So it announces the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan will be funded at $17 billion. In today's money, that would be about $130 billion. All right, that's a lot of money. I mean, you can't imagine. You can't conceive of spending $130 billion, could you? I mean, what's the war in Iraq cost so far? No one would spend $130 billion. That's funny. The war in Iraq has cost way more than like the Marshall Plan. I mean, if you just, saving Europe versus Iraq. It's really something when you think about it. But the Marshall Plan was funded at $17 billion, which at that point was a staggering amount of money. No foreign aid program had ever come near that kind of money. The point of, and there are several rationale behind the Marshall Plan. The first, of course, is to get dollars into the hands of Europeans to rebuild Europe, to also give the United States guaranteed markets. Now, this isn't a free market system. This is the beauty of it all, right? I mean, the U.S. believes in a free market system, but in fact, it doesn't simply send this money out there and say, use it any way you want. The idea here is that we are going to send $17 billion to Europe, right? But what do they have to do with that money? Well, the Americans established something called counterpart funds. You all know what the dollar gap is. That's clear, right? It's very simple. We need to get dollars into the hands of Europeans. You know, it's kind of like another statement to get into trouble with. It's kind of like a junkie giving you your first couple hits for free, right? Get you hooked, and you keep going back. And in the same way, you send $17 billion, you know, send a few dollars here, a few dollars there, and you kind of got them. And you do this through various mechanisms, such as counterpart funds. In that, the United States sends money to the Europeans, but then the Europeans have to match that money in their own currencies and deposit them in counterpart funds. So they cannot simply take this money and use it in any way they see fit. They have to match it and put it in a special fund. From that fund, they have to purchase goods from, where do you think? From the United States. Right? Now, if you give a poor person a check once a month to buy food stamps, what is that? That's welfare, right? No one wants to be on welfare. Welfare is bad, right? But if you give corporations, if you give European countries $17 billion, which they have to deposit and match and then use to purchase goods from the United States, that's okay, right? And where do they buy this from? They buy this from American companies, right? What are they buying? They're buying construction equipment, they're buying raw materials, they're buying military equipment, all right? Right. Now, what was the fear of the American economy after World War II ended? What was everybody afraid of? What was going to happen? Recession or depression, like the 30s, right? We don't want that to happen again. Now, how are we going to fix this? Well, we could vet out government contracts, and they could build schools and bridges and nursing homes and libraries and theaters and you name it, right? We could just give them money and they could build up an infrastructure, all these corporations, right? That would be wrong. That would be public money. And public money means that private money isn't being spent. And that's socialism, right? So you can't do that. So instead what we'll do is send $17 billion to Europe and then force them to buy goods back from private companies, right? Now, we could have gone direct and used it on an infrastructure in the U.S., but that was never in the cards, because that would have first of all been antithetical to private enterprise, right? That would have been public. Public money means you're not using private money. It would have been basically associated. It would have redistributed power and influence. It would have meant that, you know, people on the local school board had a say in, you know, the decisions that govern their lives. So the United States, for various political reasons, creates the Marshall Plan. It's really a brilliant program. In addition to that, if you're in Europe and you want American money, what do you have to do? Do you just say, hey man, write me out a check? Does the U.S. say, sure, what do you want? No. There are certain criteria you have to meet. Do you think a socialist government is going to get Marshall Plan money? Well, but they would have to meet certain criteria, right? You would have to reduce your debts, right? Now, how do you reduce your national debt? Right? Let's say you're a left-of-center government and you've just created a welfare program or a jobs program or a food stamp program. And all of a sudden you want Marshall Plan money. In the U.S., the ECA, the Economic Cooperation Administration, actually administers the program. And the ECA says, well, we'd like to help you out, but you have to reduce your debts. You have to get your budget closer to balance. Right? So how are you going to do that? Cut spending. What kind of spending? What did Bill Clinton do? What was part of Bill Clinton's economic miracle? Remember, what was it called? The Family Responsibility Act? Talk about Orwellian, right? What did that do, that Family Responsibility Act that Bill Clinton used to balance the budget with? It took 1.5 million people off welfare, all right? So if faced with a choice, what are you going to do? You're going to reduce public wages, right? Anybody in the public sector is going to have wages reduced. You're going to reduce programs that appeal to large segments of the population, what we would call welfare programs, right? So if you want Marshall Plan money, then you're going to have to adhere to a set of economic criteria very compatible with liberal capitalism, free market capitalism, right? So how do you, and what is the subtext of this? If you're a lefty, if you're a socialist, if you're a communist, you're not going to get U.S. support. And as a result of this, in 1948 and onward, the left in European elections continued to do worse and worse, because the other parties could say, if you want a piece of this pie, if you want Marshall Plan money, then you're going to have to go with us, because the left will hurt you. The U.S., it's politically, it's a way to contain the left. Economically, it's a brilliant way to guarantee American markets by sending money abroad, which has to be spent here, with the use of counterpart funds to maintain control over the way it's spent. And it also avoids any kind of hard decision here in the United States over using public money to restructure American society, which was never in the cards anyway. Because remember what Atchison said, we need to find foreign markets unless we're going to change the way we live. Atchison at the time was probably talking about fascism and a closed system, but clearly Atchison was a hardline Cold Warrior, and there was a left in the United States in the Depression era. All right, so this is important stuff. This is important stuff. So everybody, any questions on that? Yeah.
It almost sounds like.
You want to push the button so we can all hear you for posterity?
It almost sounds like the Marshall Plan was the same program we used in Latin America. It's the same type of control mechanisms completely.
Oh yeah, I mean this is what the IMF does, right? I mean, these aren't, we always hear, oh, the U.S. rebuilt Europe and Japan after World War II, and what did they get out of it? No, these are not gifts. These are good, cold investments. I mean, it's policy, and it works. I mean, this is brilliant stuff. My props go to these people because they were smart. They knew what they were doing, and they did it good. I mean, they built up one hell of an empire, and the amount of wealth and power they accumulated is simply staggering. They did it right. I mean, it worked. It absolutely worked. It created an incredible imbalance in the world. It impoverished much of the world. It continued to impoverish much of the world. All right? But it worked. I mean, based on their agenda. If you believe in their goals and their ideas and their agenda, then you have to stand up and give these guys, like, the longest standing ovation, because it worked. They did it right. They knew what they were doing. They planned it out. Truman's people, Truman himself, not necessarily, but, Clark Clifford and Dean Acheson and Bernard Baruch and Jimmy Burns. I mean, just a whole laundry list. I mean, these really were the best and the brightest. Yeah?
Do you happen to know, I don't have a mind.
Okay.
Do you happen to know the level of employment in the late 40s, early 50s?
The level of employment in the U.S.?
The employment rate, or unemployment rate?
Unemployment was not terribly high, surprisingly so, because usually demobilization brings really, really high rates of unemployment. I think there was a little bit of a spike, but then it went down. The other thing, too, to keep in mind, which I'm not going to mention, I think, how many, 8 or 10 million men go to college as a result of the GI Bill who never would have gone to college before. So that's, those are people who otherwise probably would have been unemployed, or a lot of them would have clearly been unemployed, right? And they have access now to a college education that they never would have had before. So the unemployment rate is actually, considering war and demobilization, actually remains fairly low.
At the time, how was it counted? Was it counted on the basis also of the women and minorities that lost their jobs?
No, I think most of those would have been considered voluntarily giving up their jobs.
Yeah, so it might have been a lot higher.
Oh, well, in real terms, there's still a lot of women. Yeah, I mean, women have always worked, but unemployment data is always skewed because women aren't included in it. So, like, a woman doing part-time work would not be considered underemployed, so the numbers are skewed, but in real terms, the numbers are actually fairly low considering, compared to the 30s, they're incredibly low, right? During the war, you had a lot of women, a lot of African Americans go north to take factory jobs, right? After the war, women especially, and we'll talk about this, but basically women are kind of given a guilt trip. Okay, you did your job now, get out of the factory, give a man that job and go home and get married and start having kids. So the numbers actually are I don't know what they are precisely. It's easy to look up, but it's a pretty good economic situation. It's an incredible economic situation. Incredible wages are quite high for white men. Mostly. The unemployment rate's quite low. Trade is what's that? Oh, the middle classes, yeah, of course. Well, the GI Bill, suburbanization, Levittown, appliances. Yeah, it's really. 1945 to probably the late 60s was kind of the heyday for the American working class. I mean, this is the way it was supposed to work. I mean, they really did quite. Guys with factory jobs, made enough money to buy a house, to buy a car, to take a vacation, send their kid to college. I mean, it really worked, for that period, and that was based on this post-war boom. Yeah.
One that also has to be viewed through a lens that today is different. You need to have a two-income family to sustain a household when in 1947.
Yeah, you're talking about the two-income household. In fact, in the United States, since 1971, wages have actually been stagnant or actually declined for that reason, because you now have two workers in the family, whereas in up to 1970, that's based on mostly one. Women don't work to the same extent they do now, where women are in the workplace pretty much almost the same percentage as men. So yeah, actually, there's been a major drop off. I mean, economically, it's been kind of a wash, but if you look at it in those terms, it's a major drop off. Yeah, I mean, how many, an average working family with just one wage earner, is basically struggling to pay rent and using a credit card for half of its purchases, and that clearly wasn't the case especially in the 50s. That really was the heyday, based on this system that these guys were. It was, I mean, think of it. They controlled 50% of global trade. Think of that. Half of the goods traded, came with a profit to the United States. That's stunning. Can you imagine that? That's huge. That's incredible. I think the U.S. now has, I forget what it is, but it's nowhere near that. It's under 10%, I believe. Around the Vietnam era, it dropped to, I think, 12 or 15. And I suspect, especially now with the emergence of the Asian economies, the little tigers in China, especially, it's probably gone down even more than that. But let me finish with the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, okay, so it is a tool for American economic power, but it's also directed to the containment of any country or system that doesn't do things the American way, have these private systems. The Marshall Plan claimed that it was open to all the countries in Europe. However, clearly the Soviet Union and others did not feel like they were open to it. Why? It's what I mentioned before. They had to have these kind of private market economies, and they had to open up all their books to Americans. So the Soviet Union was never going to do that. But let me finish here, because we're going to take a break, and then I'll pick it up when we get back, and then we'll move on.